I now get to introduce our next fantastic speaker, someone I have admired for so long. This man, I believe you are the one, Dave, who actually gave me the definition of social enterprise that I still use today, which is a business that generates revenue through trade and uses the tools of business to achieve social outcomes. Dave Moskovitz and I had the great pleasure of serving together on a ministerial advisory group that no longer exists. But through that work, I got to see the absolutely massive heart that he brings to all of his work in terms of being an angel investor, a director, a leader in New Zealand. Dave, I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked all of our panelists. What do you see as the unique strengths of New Zealand's startup ecosystem, and why will those strengths be key to thriving in a post-COVID world?
Thank you so much, Kayla. I really appreciate the introduction and to be here with this fantastic panel that you've assembled today. I want to start with the end. And actually, this is the perfect segue from Rachel as well, in that if you want to have a 500-year plan, it's the values that are going to drive you through that. Everything else is transactional. So I just want to totaku you, Rachel, and what you said, in that you really need to focus on those values and be clear about what those values are. And I think our underlying values are actually going to be what gives us the innovation edge here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But there are a number of things, number of attributes along the way which feed into those values, which I'll talk about now. The first one is scale, which you started to address, Marion, in that it's super easy to get things done here in New Zealand because we're really small. There's the 1.5 degrees of separation. It's easy to contact anyone. We have high trust, low transaction cost environment where you can, ring up any CEO of any company in an afternoon and get an interview with them or talk to them. And it's just super easy to get stuff done. You can roll out your products and services and new ideas here really quickly. And everyone can make a difference because we have that small network. You can do something and immediately see the impact ripple through. It's so easy to do. But the gene pool here can be pretty shallow. So there's certain things that we're good at and other things that we're not good at. And once we've exhausted our supply of the people that are good at doing something, all of a sudden, there's nobody left. If you piss people off, you piss too many of them off, soon you've pissed everybody off who can help you out in that particular way. We can be pretty insular. So, you still hear the question, what school did you go to? Is the first question, in a new social interaction. And we have this bias that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that we look like the rest of the world. And so we design products and services that we roll out here in New Zealand and think, we're a great success. We're just going to take this and move it over to the States. Well, it doesn't work because the rest of the world does not operate at the same small scale that we do. It looks really, really different. And distribution in particular is really key for being successful in delivering products and services overseas. But this idea of our really appropriate scale. I mean, I love Wellington, where you can walk from one side of the city to the other. You could do it in 20 minutes, but it always takes 45 because you run into about 4 or 5 people along the way that that you haven't seen in a while that you really need to catch up with. That kind of scale is really, really positive. So in a world where everything seems to be going local, we're already ahead of the pack. And us and our team of 5 million, we already know how to interact with each other really well. And we're kind of like a big family in many ways. And I think that will stand us in good stead. Another one of our strengths is diversity. And it's surprising. Did you know that in Auckland, there are 100 ethnicities and 150 spoken languages, different languages spoken in Auckland schools? 51% of Auckland's population is multilingual, according to an ERO report in 2018. So that means that we already know how to deal with diversity. And unfortunately, it gets less diverse as you go further south. But at the core, we are actually quite a diverse society. And that means that we have many great connections to other countries and other cultures, and an understanding and acceptance of those that they just don't have in other parts of the world. The Māori economy is a massive opportunity, and it's really starting to take off in a big way. And all of our highly varied backgrounds means that we have a diversity of experiences, which is really strong and ultimately results in better global products and solutions. But racism is still a significant problem in New Zealand. Old white men are still calling the shots in many spheres. 180 years later, Pakeha is still making excuses for not honoring the Treaty of Waitangi. As an example, I mean, the government had no problem spending 1.6 billion bailing out South Canterbury Finance, or 50 billion on the COVID-19 remediation, and that's 1.6 times and 50 times the total fiscal envelopes for all settlements for all treaty claims into which the government was dragged kicking and screaming. So tell me, is that fair? We need to realign some of our priorities. And then, this whole idea of inclusion is great. Oh yeah, some of my best friends are X, but inclusion is about more than eating samosas or being able to sing Te Aroha. So how is this an advantage for us? In a world where people are fearful of others that are not like them, we have the experience of working in a diverse society. And largely, we realize that diversity is a strength. And like everything else, we can improve, but our track record is pretty good and we're building off a strong base. The third attribute is transparency and trust. So our core value in New Zealand, if you were to pick one value, I think it might have been Marion who talked about it as being egalitarian. I've seen this phrase as a core value says everyone has a fair go. And a guy named David Hackett Fisher, a visiting academic from the States, came and did a study of comparing New Zealand's core values to the US's core values. New Zealand's core value was that everyone has a fair go, and the US core value was freedom, right? So how has freedom worked out for the US? You have to ask that question right now, as opposed to giving everyone a fair go. I think the COVID-19 numbers sort of tell a really interesting story about that. In the place where everyone has a fair go, it's the easiest place in the world to do business. It's the most transparent government in the world. And these are all backable statistics from international organizations. And we are doing super well in most of the international indicators that matter. Part of that is due to the fact that we have fantastic leadership and we have great role models. And you just have to look at the shining light that Jacinda has shone on the rest of the world. Whenever I talk to anyone from overseas, they say, we want your prime minister. And I say, you can't have her. We need her here. She's doing such a great job. So that transparency and trust and leadership is great, but there are a few things holding us back. One is the number 8 wire mentality. We're really great at starting stuff, but not all that great at scaling it. And Rachel sort of pointed this out before in what she was talking about. Short-term thinking is a really big part of this, and that we're really good at doing something in the shed, getting it out the door, giving it a go. It works in our garden, great, fantastic job done. Right, but when you want to scale that, it's actually quite a lot harder. And you really do need to ditch some of that short-term thinking and make the investments for thinking about what things are going to happen 500 years from now. Cognitive Center, we're particularly good at this. So Rachel mentioned her organization's 500-year plan. I'm aware of Kainui's 200-year plan for their development of Te Reo, and that long-term thinking is absolutely really critical. Investors and governments don't like taking risks, and failure can be a stigma. That's something we need to overcome. And our wealth disparity continues to grow. But, I still think, these things all add up to strength in terms of our transparency and trust and how we deal with each other. Because in a world where people are distrustful and transaction costs are high, everybody trusts New Zealand. In a world sorely lacking in leadership, we've demonstrated capability. We can all be leaders. Look around you. We have excellent role models. Grow yourself into the leader you want to be. Think about the world 500 years from now, the values that we want to leave for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And the final value really is that we care. This is our real competitive edge. What other country would you go to where you see signs along the motorway saying, be kind? I mean, that just, it just makes me so proud to be a Kiwi every time I see that, and every time I hear the Prime Minister and her team emphasizing the importance of being kind, because that really is our superpower. And that helps us be a team of 5 million. Our startup economy works that way. We work really well together, at least south of Bombay anyway. People are pretty cooperative with each other in making things happen. We are the change that we want to see in the world in this respect. So how is this an advantage? Well, in a world where people are increasingly devoid of empathy, we get what we wish for. What goes around comes around. It is local custom here in Aotearoa to pay it forward. And I wouldn't live anywhere else because I care about everyone and I feel the care that other people have for me. So everything has pros and cons, obviously, but the trick is to go in with your eyes open and maximize the advantages and mitigate the disadvantages. And there's some really interesting indicators of existing opportunities. We had a record trade surplus last month. You know, who knew? Thank you, COVID-19, record trade surplus. We have ended homelessness in cities. Again, thank you, COVID-19. So there's some really amazing opportunities out there. All we have to do is seize them and work on them together. We don't want to be the next Silicon Valley. We don't want to be the next Israel. We want to be the next New Zealand. So, and that's all up to us. And in these times of great stress and great change, the opportunities are almost unlimited. So don't waste this crisis and go back to a status quo that only suits the 1%. Let's each of us be leaders and make positive, value-driven change happen.
Can I just say that I love you so much? Thank you for demonstrating exactly how I introduced you, the massive heart that you bring to all of your mahi. I feel so privileged just to listen to you speak. Couple of things I want to pick up on. One is Dan Miranda. Hi, Dan had mentioned earlier during Rachel's session about New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand being seen as uniquely trustworthy in a trust-scarce world. So Dan asked, how can we use that? Before we get to that comment, I just want to touch on a couple of other things that you said. One is the core value of fair go versus the core value of freedom in New Zealand versus the US. And of course, I'm from the US originally. And I think one of the things that we've seen, and I've been writing about this a fair bit, is that the culture of individualism, what we're seeing now through COVID is that actually, if you benefit, I also benefit. That to me, I think one of the key lessons that I hope we learn from this is that looking after each other is not only the right thing to do, and is not only good for our hearts and good for our wairua, but also the way that we all can thrive. Because if only a small portion of the population has, for example, healthcare, then the entire population is at much greater risk. Even the ones who do have healthcare are at much greater risk, right? And so, in terms of our collective ability to thrive, I think what we're starting to see here is that individualism is actually a massive disadvantage to societies that are trying to grow and create healthy societies. So a little bit circular at the end there, sorry. So coming back to Dan's question, New Zealand seen as trustworthy in a trust-scarce world. How can we leverage that?
Well, we already have.
Mm-hmm.
So trust is something that's really difficult to build up and super easy to destroy. The good news is that we've spent, many, many years developing that trust. We've been good players. We've been honest brokers. People enjoy doing business with New Zealanders, even though if we're seen as being a bit naive in some parts of the world. But people know that they can trust us. It's not like we can suddenly go out and say, hey, we want to be more trustworthy. How do we do that? We've already done that work, and it's starting to pay off. I think in terms of, it's not so much of how do we increase that, it's how do we continue it. And the game is ours to lose. We just need to make sure that we continue to live those good values and not destroy the trustworthiness that we've spent so long to build up. And it's true that people are coming to us, getting all these I'm getting lots of inbounds from investors and startups overseas saying, hey, tell me more about New Zealand. It seems like a really interesting place. If we hadn't spent all those years being good people and building up that trust, we wouldn't be having those opportunities now. So Dan, g'day Dan, we need to get together at some stage. But the good news is we've already done the hard work, and now it's a question of how do we make the most of that, and that's up to each of us as individuals and as our organizations to really push that.
Yeah, awesome.
Getting back to what you were saying though about individualism versus collectivism, and there's a Maori whakatoki as well. Again, going back to our tangata whenua values here and the importance that has to the greater society in Aotearoa, and forgive me for misquoting it, and I can't quote it in Te Reo, but with my kete and your kete, we can feed everyone, and I think that is by and large people's attitude. We are willing to give up a bit so that everyone around us is prosperous.
Yeah, I remember a fantastic talk from a while ago that went quite far, that was showing that if countries are less equal, in countries that are less equal, everyone suffers. Rich people in countries that are less equal do worse on all of our kind of social well-being outcomes than rich people in countries that are more equal. So it really is to everyone's advantage for us to be addressing inequities, for us to be addressing historical inequities, systemic racism, homelessness, poverty, all of those things, because we all benefit when we look after each other. You mentioned about New Zealand's tendency to bring a number 8 wire approach to things, that we're very good at starting, not as good at scaling. Karen Foreman Brown raises another point that comes up often, which is this idea that as New Zealanders, we tend to be outward looking and assume that ideas from overseas are better. I've observed both sides of this equation in my work. I've observed that people don't want to hear things unless they're coming from an overseas expert. And at the same time, we have an attitude of we don't need no stinking overseas experts. And so I've seen this as like a bit of a conflict. What's your take on this? Do we suffer from imposter syndrome as a country? Are we holding ourselves back from achieving our true greatness? What do you think?
Yes and no. I'm going to hedge that question because I have seen people paying more attention to overseas experts than they do to local indigenous solutions to problems. But because we're a very well-traveled cohort, I think the best sort of advice that we can get is from Kiwis who've been overseas and come back. And people who actually have spent a lot of time in other parts of the world where conditions are different. Because as I pointed out before, New Zealand does not look like the rest of the world. And ideas that are good for the rest of the world might not be good for New Zealand and vice versa. So I think what we can do is make ourselves more aware, to travel more once that becomes possible again, to pay attention to people who've been overseas and come back again and had the chance to look at the wide variety of solutions and different ways of looking at problems and use that. We had a discussion before about, gee, isn't it awful that overseas firms buy our companies and then that all goes overseas. I have some wonderful counterexamples to that, of where overseas companies come in, bought a New Zealand company, and what do you know? The next thing you know, the New Zealand founders of that company are actually running the big overseas concern and gaining the experience that they need to expand into those markets, and then they come back and do it over again. So yeah, just seeking that hybrid, the diversity of solutions, diversity of viewpoints, I think is really important.
Yeah, awesome. We have a question from Lily Stender, and this sort of builds on the conversation, the korero we had with Rachel Tolele, but I'm curious about this question from your perspective as an investor and working in the investor ecosystem. How do we get investors to believe in our intergenerational values-driven products? How do we get investors specifically to value that when so many investors are simply looking for financial return?
Well, the good news is that if you look at short-term investment prospects, they're pretty bad right now. So I think many investors will be looking at their long-term investment strategy and their portfolio strategy to include some long-term investments as well as some short-term investments. We are driven quarter by quarter in the financial world, and it is difficult to come up with those 500-year plans when you have no idea what's going to be happening next quarter. So part of that is about finding the right investors, the investors who are themselves into it for intergenerational reasons, as opposed to the your slash and burn private equity type people. Family offices are a really good place to start because many of these family offices have a really long-term view and long-term values that they're trying to base their investments on. It is hard to find the right investors, and when you said, Kyla, that I think it was you, might have been Mary, who was saying that VC is at an all-time high in New Zealand. We're still off a really, actually it might have been Melissa. We're still working off a really, really low base, and I haven't seen in the tech startup area the sort of volume of venture investing that I would like to see. But again, getting the right diverse mix of investors in is really important. And Yeah, there's no easy solution um, to how do we get people to take a longer term perspective. It's not only investors, it's government, it's all the people around us. You know, as we become more aware and more sensitive to longer term needs and to a longer term vision, I think investors will come along the road. But there's no short term fix. This is a 500-year problem. Let's start working on it now, Lily.
Awesome. It's just, I think, a reflection of the brilliance of this panel that you're like, I think it was Marion. No, it was Melissa. Maybe it was Rachel. Dave, that takes us to the end of our time with you. Thank you so much for sharing your Facado, your Corrido. It's been so wonderful to hear your insights this morning.